Hi! Let's make a wizard's dice tower. I started off by cutting strips of foam core using a makeshift Balsa stripper. Trent from Miscast actually has a tutorial on how to make one, so I won't go into too much detail. There will be a link in the description if you want to check it out. I really recommend making one since it's so easy and cheap to make, plus it saves so much time when cutting so many bricks. Now that I hopefully have enough bricks for the foreseeable future, I can start building the actual tower. For the base, I'm cutting a circle that is a bit larger than what my tower will be out of foam core. I then place on it something round and tall and start gluing my bricks one after another. Do note, you probably want to wrap whatever you're using in wax paper so your glue doesn't stick to it. I didn't do this at the start and well, yeah. When that was done, I came in with a rock and textured the brick to look more like stone. Now for the actual tray where the dice will roll out to, I want something a bit sturdier, so I'm using 1 cm thick foam core. Using the tower as a guide, I cut it to shape and removed the paper from the top side. I never measure anything in my life, it's just eyeballing. I wish I could give you measurements, but yeah. To give it a cobblestone look, I start carving in circles of varying shapes and sizes with a pencil. After that, I came back in with a pencil and made some of the stones more recessed. I actually don't recommend doing this since I noticed it kind of messes with some of the dice. I then began placing the same bricks I made earlier around the tray to serve as a border. Now for the roof, I started off by marking the top layer of bricks to equal sizes using a toilet paper roll as a reference. I then took some popsicle sticks and glued them to each other using the lines I marked as a guide. When the glue cooled off, I could then chop off any excess and my base for the roof was ready. After that, I cut a piece of wooden dowel that is approximately the height I want the roof to be. I stuck the base structure and the wooden dowel to a piece of construction paper, and then with more popsicle sticks connected all the dots to the center. Now I need a way for the dice to actually get into the tower. So I took a toilet paper roll and cut its edge at an angle and made it a bit smaller so it can fit between the supports. I then glued it into the base of the roof and cut an opening in the paper just under where the roll is. To fill in the empty space between the supports, I cut triangles out of construction paper and glued them in. This doesn't need to be perfect as it will be covered in shingles soon enough. To give the roof a bit more character, I cut trapezes out of paper and attached them to the bottom side at an angle different from the rest of the roof. For the shingles themselves, I cut rectangles out of construction paper. I made them a bit longer than what I intended them to show through, so I can have some room to play with. After that, I glued them to the roof, making sure to offset each row. To cap the roof, I took a piece of balsa wood and started carving it into an interesting shape. Balsa is very easy to cut and make cool shapes with, so just go wild. Now, to make the toilet paper roll look a bit more like an actual chimney, I glued in a piece of plastic that was the inside part of a tape. Next, I cut different sized rectangles out of paper and glued them to the chimney at a strange random way, overlapping one another. To give it an old, corroded metal look, I covered it with superglue and then sprinkled it with baking soda. And finally, to make rivets, I used thick PVA glue and dabbed it to the edge of each square. Now, so the dice will actually be able to roll out of the tower, I needed to make a front door. I find it easier to mark and cut out the opening after it's all glued up, rather than trying to awkwardly glue it around the gap. So, after marking out my plan, I cut out the door and windows with an X-Acto knife. Now, the tower looked a bit too uniformed, so I cut out much larger bricks out of foam core, making sure to cut their thickness in half so they won't protrude so much. To make the edges of the door and windows look a bit cleaner, I did the same thing, just using the smaller bricks. Now that the main construction was done, I gave everything a liberal coat of Mod Podge matte mixed with black paint to make it all nice and durable. To make the actual windows, I took a piece of mesh and painted it first with black and then with silver. I used a scrap piece of plastic packaging and cut it into a sheet a bit larger than my window size. To glue the mesh to the plastic, I used superglue, only at the corners of the plastic so it would not fog the entire window. When it dried, I was able to easily cut the excess mesh and glue it into the inside of the tower. And, just to make sure it wasn't visible, I painted the edges in black. To give the dice platforms to bounce off of, I used black foam core and cut it into 1 circle and 2 crescent moon shapes and glued them in using a generous amount of hot glue. Now for painting, I started off base coating all the stone with an earthy grey color, then proceeded to randomly pick and paint stones and bricks in different bright colors to give it more variety. Next, I dry brushed everything with a light grey, followed by a tan. I was being pretty aggressive with the dry brushing, as I knew the black wash afterwards would dull everything down and make it all unified. After the wash was completely dry, I came back in with a final dry brush of light grey to bring back some of the edges. Now, the black wash could have dulled some of the stone too much. In that case, you can use shades and inks to bring back some color. For the roof, I started off by ripping a piece of packaging sponge and dabbing it in silver paint, trying not to have too much paint in the sponge. I then dabbed the chimney with it, trying to cover most of it, but still leaving some black showing through. When the silver paint was dry, I used different shades of copper and gold, covering less and less as the layers progressed. And finally, to dull it down a bit, I covered it with a black wash, followed by a selective brown wash. Because I wanted the roof to be pretty saturated, I started off by base coating it with a bright tan. I then used a dark blue paint that doesn't have the best coverage. When it dries, the yellowish undercoat will show through and give the roof a nice shade of teal. To dull the color down a bit, I washed the roof with black, but dabbed off any excess with a paper towel, leaving the wash just in the recesses. To finish it off, I painted the roof cap with a warm gold and washed it with a reddish brown. Now that everything was painted, I could add in the final touches. I first cut strips of thin balsa wood, which I then gave them a wooden texture using a pointy sculpting tool. Then, using a mix of black ink, sepia ink, and water, I washed the pieces, letting it soak into the wood. When they were dry, I glued them to the tower in columns. Now, to add some moss, I mixed some fine turf and PVA glue and smeared it all over the build. Granted, I think I went a little bit overboard, and I definitely should have gone with the less is more approach. To add the final touch of color, I glued in reddish fall leaves with superglue, though I definitely recommend using PVA instead. I wanted to try my hand at making a dice tower myself, since most of those I saw out there leaned more to the castle tower kind of style, and I thought a wizard's tower could have a nice look to it. Anyways, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, bye!